My name is Mina Chow, and this is Thomas Spiegelhalter. We're both faculty from the USC School of Architecture, and we're really, really pleased to bring you this Visions and Voices event. I think that all of you would agree that we're actually living in really exciting times. With the historical inauguration of the 44th President of the United States happening only yesterday, and Martin Luther King Day just a couple of days ago, which we were off for the holiday, that I'm sure you guys noticed that, I think that all of us are really infused with a great sense of hope. When we first thought about the title for this lecture, we were hopeful to reach the broadest possible audience. And I see that we actually have gotten a lot of different students from different departments like the art and engineering schools. Because we wanted to reach this broad audience because for too long the issues that architects find important have remained too esoteric. And sustainability is far too important an issue to remain inaccessible to the public. So I thought, what better way is there to reach a public than through its music? I also thought that Ian Ritchie seemed to me to be the kind of guy that was very down to earth, you know, real, unaffected by academic posturing, and that he would get it, or at least be polite and British enough to pretend to get the reference to a cheesy American folk song. And for those of you who don't know the song, it goes, "This land is your land, this land is my land," you know, whatever, okay? Okay, a little bit bad singing, sorry. I also thought about the similarity in character and innovation and conviction in Ian's work, as well as Woody Guthrie, the writer of the "This Land Is Your Land" song. Woody was a nonconformist, just like Ian is. He practiced what he preached, just like Ian does. He was a hard-hitting advocate for truth, fairness, and justice. And if this doesn't really resonate with you now, I want you guys to notice that I really want you to look for the conviction in Ian's work. And it should resonate with you after the lecture. In fact, now that we recognize that the earth is in trouble and that we're running out of resources, what better time is it than now for us to remember that we're all in this together? This land is our land, so we're responsible to and for each other, and we're stewards for our planet. So we later added the greening, architecture, ethics, and the environment in order to bring focus to our discipline. Okay. Thomas is going to say a few words.
So when Mina and I tried to get Ian Ritchie to Los Angeles, I contacted one of my former colleagues, Henning Rambo, which is running his sister office in Leipzig, and is a good friend to Ian Ritchie too. And one day, actually after 3-4 emails and telephone calls, Ian was saying to Henning Rambo that he has kind of nightmares and doubts to do this trip to Los Angeles and to waste resources and to cause about 4 to 5 tons British carbon. So then we called back and we sent 10 more emails and make telephone calls and try to convince him with the fact that if he's going to give us a stimulating and inspiring lecture, then many more of the visitors here will follow him and offset carbon. So, Mina.
Yup, we had to go all the way to Great Britain because the Europeans have been practicing sustainability for way longer than us Americans, so they know more about carbon footprints than we do. Who better to show us an ideal versus the real than somebody who's been practicing it for over 30 years? All great work must surpass what it appears to be. The work of Ian Ritchie is not just about sustainability. It must encompass much more to qualify as award-winning architecture, which it really is. Ian Ritchie Architects in London and Bryce Francis Ritchie, his engineering firm, have won numerous awards in outstanding architectural design and engineering, including last year's AIA Award commendation for the Royal Shakespeare Company Courtyard Theatre and the AIA Award of Design Excellence for his Plymouth Theatre Royal Production Center in 2003, and his Crystal Palace concert platform, which also received an AIA Award for Design Excellence in 1997. Ian Ritchie uses the interplay between words and images to distill varied influences from technology, social concerns, history, context, into absolutely exquisite and delicate forms. So I want you please to look for all of this in his presentation. Language is a common currency between them, and its potential opened up to him first when he was a student, just like you guys, when he was hanging out with a poet. So for all of you students out there, remember, poetry is really cool. Look for the poetry in everything. We also have Frances Anderton, our moderator, and who will be moderating the Q&A right after the lecture. She's the elegant voice of KCRW's DNA, Design and Architecture, and the producer of To the Point Which Way LA with Warren Olney. She's also the LA editor of Dwell magazine. We would like to thank the USD Visions and Voices program, and especially Daria Yudakovsky, who's sick with the flu right now, the British Consulate General, David Wild, the Deputy Consulate General, who basically listened to me rant and rave for the last week, the USC Architectural Guild, Co-Architecture International, and the American Institute of Architects, Los Angeles, for their generous support of this event. We also would like to give special thanks to Dean Ma for his vision and his passion for new ideas. So I want you guys to remember to stay for the Sustainable Foods reception, and it's going to be underneath the colonnade, and I'm going to hand the podium over to Ian right now. Okay.
Good evening. It's about 3:30 or 4:30 in the morning. I got off the plane this afternoon, and I think Mina left out somebody in her thanks. I don't fly British Airways because they kind of treat you like nannies on the aeroplane. So I fly Virgin, and I think Virgin got me here slightly cheaper than it would have been normally. My talk this evening is in 3 parts. Either side of me wandering around doing a sort of show and tell about some projects, I'm actually going to read a lecture, because a bit like Barack yesterday, he got a bit serious. So do I. I get serious too sometimes. But do look for the humor between the lines, and I apologize if my humor is not necessarily understood in this country of yours. Tell me if you can you hear me? I'm going to go over here. Okay. Where's he gone? Okay. Self and unself, freedom and incarceration, independence and interdependence. This is the dialectic of our age. More than economy, more than efficiency, and more than visual aesthetics. A selfless architecture. It's simple to announce, but to get there, more difficult. Intelligent, social, and selfless architectural expression, capable of marvelous and spiritually uplifting structures must challenge turn-of-the-century stunt-making architectural gymnastics. I feel that we're at the beginning of a new paradigm, a seriously important new movement in urbanity and architecture. Any resulting visual aesthetic will be multifarious, derived from a synthesis of science, ecology, and ethics. It hinges crucially on the creative desire of man to express himself unselfishly. Of course, this opposes recent architectural isms and superficial and selfish architecture that gratifies itself on hyperbole, the first, the biggest, the latest, and so on. An architecture which represents the media and consumer-induced self-aggrandissement, self-promotion in American, I think it's called. The insatiable appetite for the new, the different, and the unique image that drives the present economy of the so-called developed world need not, however, be sacrificed in the search for radical improvement in social and environmental conditions. But it is the ethos behind the search for radical improvement which will deliver a different architecture. Today, for design to have any significance, we must embrace not only Homo faber, the maker, but Homo sapiens sapiens. Tonight, I will address this issue by posing 5 questions around 5 issues. The first is heritage. How does our intellectual heritage shape our actions? The second one is thinking, and what are we thinking about now? Behavior. How are we behaving as designers? Fourth one is design. How should we design today? I notionally call it innovate or die. And finally, 5, intervening. How should we personally make things? In other words, we, and this includes my own practice and the collaborative architecture produced over 30 years, seek a synthesis of art, science, technique, landscape, and economy with that more tricky condition, a moral context. Let's step back 2,500 years to hint at the origins of our present discomfort of having to live with apparent contradictions. How can we tame Homo consumeris? The Greeks sought to reconcile the idea put forward by the philosopher Heraclitus of perpetual change and eternal becoming with that of the unchangeable being put forward by Parmenides. The outcomes had a profound impact upon the development of Western society. The paradox was resolved when the Greeks thought of the atom as the inert, fundamental, unchangeable being, yet which, moved by undefined forces, spirits, could combine with other atoms to generate change. The wholeness of life was split between matter and spirit, between body and soul. Investigations of the human soul and ethics, rather than materials, dominated Western thinkers and society up to the Renaissance, the European Renaissance, when a renewed interest in matter and the natural world occurred. Descartes gave a subtle new dimension to this division, to the idea of mind and matter. He separated man from nature, the subject from the object. Rather than finding ourselves at one with nature, Descartes inadvertently took us on a path separating us further from nature. He took us towards a world where man thought himself more important than nature, and which consequently justified man's actions in exploiting nature's riches for his own benefit. In the early 20th century, Heisenberg and Bohr, with their Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, suggested that when a human being observes an event, it changes the reality of the event. In a manner of speaking, this brought man and nature back to an interdependence. Meanwhile, in other regions of the world, there was no such apparent split between man and nature. Buddhism and Taoism, for example, bear witness to this and describe, much as Heraclitus did, the cyclical nature of change. However, in the last few hundred years, our Western ways have impacted hugely upon the traditions of other cultures and upon the nature of the planet we share. We are left occupying a conundrum. Civilization, according to the late American social anthropologist Stanley Diamond, could be regarded as a system in internal disequilibrium. Technology, ideology, and social organization are always out of joint with each other, or certainly one is always out of joint with the other two. So moving on, thinking. What are we thinking about now? Connexity is an old English word. It embodies the notion of a worldwide society deeply interconnected and interrelated between man and man, machine and machine, and man and machine. The mathematician invents rules from the world of abstract thought. The scientist, through investigation, seeks to explain better to us the natural world that is us and around us. These are our two worlds, mind and nature. The engineer applies the knowledge gained from the investigators. The artist dances between the two, affected by the society he is living in. An architect dances as well, seeking to synthesize and harmonize physical matter with the poetic. But are we able to think about nurturing this planet and life on it collectively and more intelligently? Or are we, the rich, still in such a state of shock that we will encourage our political and economic advisors to consider first and foremost recovering our national and individual wealth, and then to carry on promoting our personal freedoms to recover and accumulate even more? Today we are living with a dominant economic theory that has placed liberty before equality. This condition has given markets more power than nations, promoted deregulation instead of regulation, and permitted a culture of individual greed without conscience. Historically, we have fought against other nations and other religions to promote and defend our notion of freedom. This idea of freedom has served us well, but for the past 3 decades, it has tended towards the extreme limits of social acceptance and tolerance. It now handicaps progress. The pendulum has swung too far towards the individual and his freedoms at the expense of both our sense of community and our planet. Freedom is now synonymous with independence, ultimately manifested in the idea that I can do what I want if I can physically or financially achieve it. Nations have done the same. And of course, we know the condition has produced rogue traders, obscene levels of bonuses, and more recently, the collapse of the banking system. Freedom requires a framework, an order. It is the idea of order and of rules which offers continuity in the understanding of how our society evolves. And the quality of order can only be measured by achieving a balance between individual freedom and community, between independence and interdependence. And this needs resetting more urgently now than ever, as we ironically become less and less responsible for our lives. In the West, we have become the product of our own economic thinking, to the point where financial reward can be obtained from being irresponsible, from not caring for others or our environment. The quality of life is strained, and most people cannot choose or control it. This leads to a sense of alienation, of loneliness, deprives us of seeing ourselves as anything more than vessels. Surviving what life puts in front of us is the reality for most people. The emergence and growth of townships and shanty towns as a result of imposed world economic policies or of particular political ideologies are the nests of the majority of humankind. Do we think our cities, for the minorities that live in them, are any more sustainable today? I doubt it. And in Mumbai still, we have greenwashing by 2 American firms of architects. I don't understand it. And life without meaning becomes consumerism. Let's not delude ourselves. We live in an age of quantity, not quality, of individualism, not community. We live to produce, to consume, and to waste. We seem unable to recognize that our real treasure is our fellow human beings and the planet. Our art is now excessively subjective, excessively decadent. The decline in the only lifelong relationship we have, the family, is paralleled in the rise of an increasingly contractual and litigious social world. Yet it takes only one generation to really care, and we have a real chance for positive change. I think you are this generation that needs to make the move. 40 years ago, Robert Kennedy wrote in a text entitled "The American Environment," and let us be clear at the outset that we will find neither national purpose nor personal satisfaction in a mere continuation of technical progress, in an endless amassing of worldly goods. We cannot measure national spirit by the Dow Jones average or national achievement by the gross national product. For the gross national product includes our pollution and advertising for cigarettes, and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and jails for people who break them. The gross national product includes the destruction of redwoods and the death of lakes. It grows with the production of napalm and missiles and nuclear warheads, and it even includes research on the improved dissemination of bubonic plague. The gross national product swells with equipment for the police to put down riots in our cities. And though it is not diminished by the damage these riots do, still it goes up as slums are rebuilt on their ashes. It includes Whitman's rifle and Speck's knife, and the broadcasting of television programs which glorify violence to sell goods to our children. That was 40 years ago. Much of the talk on the environment today is 2050. That's 40 years from now. I honestly doubt if anybody has any idea what the world will be like in 40 years' time. But it's a useful number, and human beings like round numbers, and they like zeros. Our culture is driven by competition, not altruism, which has produced an aggressive, rough, tough, and fast world in which matter matters, and fewer seem to benefit. It is dominated by economics and by economists who are not sufficiently engaged with creating methodologies that embrace the needs of the wider natural environment or of the poor. Any architecture we create in the West, no matter what its visual reference or theoretical underpinning, maintains to a greater or lesser extent this status quo. I quite like putting up Horace, the Hoover. Partly because at the end of the Yellow Submarine film, he not only sucked up the film, but he's disappeared up his own existence, which is where we're heading. Often, we had the impression of 20th century attitudes to progress and the future as being characterized by optimism and, above all, certainty. Architectural modernism grew out of this and was underpinned by a desire to share the fruits of progress with as many people as possible through new housing, education, and welfare facilities. This was the last real architectural movement that was founded on an idea more fundamental than finding a new superficial or spatial or formal architecture. I was disappearing for a moment. There is an ecological debt from the historical inequality of the use of natural resources, coupled with the inequalities of the global finance systems. We now know that we cannot simply turn off the tap, so to speak, to prevent climate change and sea level rise. But we have to act now to mitigate the effects. We have to challenge the economic model of growth regardless of the cost or consequences. A new economy based upon an altruistic relationship with our planet seems a worthwhile ambition. It does not mean that there will be no competitive economy. Through competition between altruistic endeavors, we can create a benign and sustainable economy, one that respects, nurtures, and eventually will have a positive impact upon the biosphere of the shared world. This is an immense challenge, perhaps the greatest challenge humanity has faced. But what an opportunity. I am no economist, and I may be financially naive, but it seems evident that a new monetary system is required alongside a new environmental approach. The one without the other will not redress the connexity imbalance between man and man and the planet. At which point I can dance, sort of. I'm just going to go through a few projects quite quickly, drawing attention to the essential character. Half the battle in doing architecture, I find, is in fact discovering what I might call the essential, the simple, because all architecture gets incredibly complicated. This particular monument for Dubai, we developed new geodesic, if you like, patterns on the surface of a sphere. They're based on Arab geometries. And when we started with a square and a pentagon, and this is 1986, 87, even the worldwide firm of Arab couldn't stitch a square and a pentagon around a sphere. We were the era of triangles, as you may recall. The technology here doesn't allow me to change the slides when I'm walking about, so I have to keep coming back. I'll explain very simply. I write first. I investigate using language. Mina made reference to a poet. There actually are several poets in Liverpool, known as the Liverpool Poets, and I used to hang out with him in a Greasy Spoon cafe. And one of them, Roger McGuff, opened my mind and my ears to English. I didn't realize that English could be used as a tool in a way to excavate ideas. And so I write to investigate. I write sometimes poetry, sometimes prose. From that, I then try and take a Japanese or a Chinese brush, depending what mood I'm in, and with one line or two lines, try to distill and capture what my investigations have led to. It's a strange way of working for an architect, but I find if I draw first, the images of the drawings lock into my brain too quickly, and I can't get rid of them. Using words, they open up a completely different field. This was the first sketch for a house, and it's the very first house I ever did. And it was in France, so I had to learn French, and I went there and built it with my girlfriend. And it wasn't for me. I was 28 years old. And the last thing I'd ever made, either at school or university, were little models and a toast rack. And I had this house made. It started off in the north part of Ireland, where the solar panels were made. The lorry went to Dublin and picked up the structure. It then went to Holland to pick up the flooring, then went to Germany to get some other bits and pieces, and it ended up in a farmyard in France. And all it is an insulated umbrella in a landscape. The diagonal line is a chimney for a wood-burning stove, which comes out through the glass, because that way you don't have to penetrate the waterproofing, and it could be a lot easier. My girlfriend is the one pointing in the image. There. Is that working? Yeah, right. Yep. You can see over here, pigs. The site had been probably for 50 years, chickens and pigs. So the topsoil was unbelievably rich. So we scraped it off and kept it, and of course all the plants grew very quickly. Just below the pigs is a fresh air preheater, solar panel preheater for the air that comes fresh into the house. One fan drives everything. Then you have lots of silver blinds that drop down. These are the replacement blinds, because these photographs were taken a couple of years ago. The original ones eventually ripped. The original blinds came from a spin-off from the NASA program, space program, and it was a lining, a second layer down in the astronauts' gloves, which was a aluminium-coated material which was perforate. And of course, it reflected all of the energy. On the east and west facades are the solar panels, and these are passive, what is notionally called trombi walls. Normally you have mass behind the wall. Here we use metal and 3 layers of air before the lining inside the house, the white panels here. If I might mark up these ones, which are behind here as well. And they're made of compressed linen flax. What the farmer grew in the field, we turned into panels. And they have wonderful surface texture of the grasses in the building. The lady it was designed for is still living there, and she's 89 years old, and she wanders around a lot of space. The organization of the plan was the morning was where the bedrooms were, lunchtime is where the south is, and the relaxation in the evening is where the sun sets. Not complicated. A second house was built by myself and some students from the Architectural Association where I was teaching, although we didn't make the structure. This time the energy was actually drawn in through the roof rather than the side walls. And Peter Cook, who you probably know the name, is Archigram, he described this house as the first deconstructed house that crashed aeroplane in Britain. It had nothing to do with deconstruction. It was simply the idea of a bird, and I really ought to, very briefly, I'll read you the poem that I wrote before I actually drew anything. And it's called The Suitcase, a prelude to Eagle Rock House. As we search for freedom, another seeks orchids. As we learn to build, another dreams of a house. A parent bird, an eagle, and her young offspring lead thoughts of redefining home as a suitcase. A bird carrying a suitcase, so free, yet so tied to history. Is there a house in liberty? What is in the suitcase? Might seem strange now, but that was 20, 30 years ago. And in a sense, it was the beginnings of an engagement where the landscape is dictating the evolution of the design. Another project of quite a long time ago, done with Catherine Gustafsson, was looking at the Maritime Museum in London, which you can see there in the foreground. This building, Christopher Wren, Inigo Jones, famous architects of England, and across here a landscape. All the money is over here, and this was a time before Canary Wharf was even dreamt of. And we thought we'd spin a coin across the river, let it hit the bank, push up a bit of earth, and insert a museum without air conditioning, simply creating its own climate. And this moved up the earth. We created a space, and we put steps in the front, which you can see on the top model. These steps. And between them, you can see out across at the great perspective of Greenwich. And the boats are hung in the space, and the workshops below. A very simple concept. A bit later, France, in all its majesty, decided to offer Japan a monument, in the same way that the France, 100 years before, had offered America a monument. Your Statue of Liberty, in case you didn't know what I was referring to. Anyway, the French had this idea that they'd have a monument to communications. And it was predicated on the idea that the Japanese at the time weren't really communicating with the rest of the world. And they had a competition. And our entry was essentially based on a software. And we're going back, this is kind of almost pre-personal computers. And a friend of mine, Olivier Aubert, developed a software where any individual can create a 20-pixel icon, which is their signature. And you ring up the générateur poétique, and your icon, your hieroglyph, will appear on your screen. And you can move it around with your cursor. So you could join, if yours is red, you might join the red ones, or you might want to be independent. And of course, corporates like McDonald's today, or IBM then, might have all their employees ring up at the same time and create the logo. And we have an interactive global painting. He also developed the technique whereby any hieroglyph meeting another one along any of its four edges, you could press a key and you'd be in voice contact via the telephone. So you could be talking to somebody in Peru like that. What you're talking about might be tricky, but it was an interesting development which was then adopted for the conference industries in Europe later on. But the idea was you had this exchange, this connexity on the planet that we share one world. We then did the mad thing of making this screen, this painting, housed within a ring. And the ring was 365 meters in diameter. So it was a 1.2 kilometer walk, inside of which is the continuous screen. And then we levitated it off the ground because we thought it would be quite nice not to touch the ground, with some super magnets developed by the French Scientific Research Institute. These magnets are so powerful that the end of this would drag everybody towards me. They're not allowed out, these magnets. They're kept in cellars. So you could ask yourself, what would happen if there were people up there? Well, obviously you levitate by having similar poles that you separate. And that actually neutralizes the effect, theoretically. Anyway, it didn't get built because the Japanese wanted Olivier's patent, his software, and they wanted to build the entire thing. The Americans were much more sensible 100 years ago. They said, okay, we'll build the rock, you give us the sculpture. But the Japanese wanted to do everything. In the end, Mitterrand, the president, cancelled the project, which was a testimony to communications. This building here is probably, and still is, the largest glass hall in the world. And it's simply an entrance hall. And we were brought in a bit like Red Adair. The architects who were doing the master plan, the young architects in his office weren't happy with the design. One of those young architects had worked in our office and asked me when I was giving a lecture in Cologne in Germany if I'd come by and help sort it out. They had a design that in one connection between the walls and the roof, there were more problems given the scale of the building, than we probably have in all of our buildings put together. So I said no. But if you'd like to do this, we'll help you. So for the same floor area, we took something like 30% of the surface area of the shell away and saved 30 million Deutschmark, which is roughly 15 million euros or $15 million. So the client was very happy. So was the architect. So we built this hall. And then we did something mad, not out of our choice, but at the time there were 2 European producers of what we call low iron glass. That's where the iron is taken out of the glass and doesn't make it green, it makes it clear. It's like your wine glass or your beer glass. One of them was PPG, Pittsburgh plate glass, and the other one was Pilkington. And the cheaper, less expensive one was from Pittsburgh. Most of it arrived by ship and then by train. But they got late in the production. And I was horrified that the last batches delivered were delivered by 747 by air, which is completely and utterly insane. However, very nice, simple building, but integrated in the whole approach was a naturally ventilated building, and in the winter where it goes down to -20 in Leipzig, and Thomas can vouch for that, I'm sure, we established with the client that we would maintain somewhere between 18 and 20 degree difference between outside and inside. So if it's -10 outside, this is centigrade, I'm sorry, I can't do Fahrenheit anymore. We would have 8 degrees or 9 degrees inside. And that was achieved simply by where people are and putting the heat beneath their feet. So the space is not heated per se, it's just the feeling of warmth. And of course the fundamental question, if this is the entrance hall and you have these big exhibition halls by the side, where do you take your coat off? Do you take it off at the exhibition hall or do you take it off here? If you take it off here, you then have to moderate the climate. But you'll see in the sketch up the top left that right at the very beginning of the sketches, in comes the maintenance man. And this is a little bit about maintenance and the way that wind and air moves. And also the studies of condensation, all of those things that you normally do on a building. Significantly, the building is about 900 feet long. Yeah. 300 yards long. And it has no expansion joint. Now, any structural engineer will tell you you must have expansion joints every 30, 60 meters, depending on the structure. I don't like expansion joints because they make things complicated. So we have none on the shell, which is this structure here. But what we have at the bottom along here, at every little connection to the ground, is a bridge bearing. So we fix the building in the middle, and you allow it to expand like an accordion. And once you know how much it expands, you can deal with it. Clearly, that keeps everything that much simpler, and the elegance is maintained. And we even designed, well, we didn't design them. The Fraunhofer Institute in Magdeburg, we approached very early on with the idea of developing robots, with one here, to clean the glass. So they go in and out of all these frog fingers. And the client is very nice to me. When I take potential clients to Leipzig to see the building, they always arrange to have the robots working, which is nice. And that's the different maneuvering, if you like, of playing with space that it can do. This building is a concert platform. If you sing outside, or if I was giving this lecture outdoors, you'd be totally dependent on big speakers to hear. You've all been to rock music festivals and stadia. The rock industry went from sort of 10,000 watts to 2 million watts in sound output during the sort of 70s to 80s. If you've got an orchestra playing outdoors, my instant reaction was, what's it like being a violinist? Can you hear what you're playing? Can you hear what your colleagues are playing? And we introduced into the shell, so I wasn't worried about the audience, they're irrelevant at this point, because no reflected sound was going to go out to 5,000 people. You need speakers. But what we built into the shell here were speakers and microphones in that position. So as soon as the sound was played, it was straight through a computer, processed, back to the orchestra or the choir or the jazz musicians, whoever was playing, such that, for example, a choir could feel they were singing in a cathedral. A jazz band could feel they were playing in a cellar. So the atmosphere on stage was fantastic. And we also designed it that they wouldn't play all year, so essentially it's a vandal. It could be vandalized very easily. So it sits in a lake. That doesn't stop the kids jumping the lake to get on. It doesn't matter if they scratch the steel, because it's core 10, it'll just rust again. Or even if they put graffiti on. So in a way, this building has no maintenance. It has trace heating for the computer space and for the changing rooms, for the water. There is no other maintenance involved. And it sits there like a butterfly. One of the great challenges of the 21st century is power. We're great guzzlers of it. We were lucky enough to win a competition with the EDF, the Electricity of France, for new pylons. The only reason they had the competition was because they had promised to sell electricity to Spain, and in Europe, right through to Russia, electricity flows around all over the place. There's a super grid of AC power. And England buys it from France, France sells it to Spain, stuff comes in, it just goes all over the place all the time. But sometimes they can't build the power lines because they're considered ugly. And the French government asked the Electricity Board of France, well, they told them, you've got to redesign your pylons and look at better ways of placing them in the landscape. And we won the competition. Again, maintenance. Normally you go up these triangulated structures. Sometimes you have the ones that look like this, in America as well. But the poor guys on the outside, they are a nightmare to maintain and to get at the electrical cables and the maintenance. So we decided to build them as shells with a curve. And you could climb up the inside. You can rest inside. You make a cup of tea if you're ready. So they're protected until they go out to work on the lines themselves. Small project, International Rowing Centre. Very, very simple. The roof, which you can see there, I think. Yeah, you can see it. If I have a little arrow here. These three curves, they're catenaries. That's, I'm sure you all know, you take a material, depending on what force you put on the edge, you get a natural curvature. And if you have enough stiffness in the material, it'll stop it reversing under suction load of wind. Well, you've basically got three gutters, one pitch, end of story. So that's the building sorted. The columns that support the roof were designed to take double sculls, quads, and eights. So there's no secondary structure to hold the boats. And down in Plymouth, one of these AIA award buildings, I decided that it's about time that we saw soft metal as buildings. It's very hard to lean against a steel column. It's cold. You'll lean against a brick column or a stone column, but not metal. Metal is cold, hard. Yet it doesn't have to be. So we decided to weave the enclosure of these buildings out of phosphor bronze. The result of which is, instead of having 2 or 3 millimeter thick copper, we end up with an average of 0.4 millimeters of copper. So it's 8 to 10 times less copper used to wrap the building. And it's soft, and you can push it, and it changes, and the birds shit on it. Which is quite nice. And I asked the client never to clean the bronze, because there's no need. So there's a sort of everlasting Jackson Pollock painting done by the birds. And the guano, when it streaks, because it comes in like that and it goes shh, you get fluorescent greens and golds and reds. It's very nice. And in the inside, throughout most of it, we used simple plywood. And plywood up to 4 meters, so that all the workshop where they make theatre and so on, if they want to replace, the plywood can be recycled, just put a new piece of plywood down. And in a way, it elevated a very humble material, which we normally see for things like rough shuttering, suddenly becoming the internal finish of a building. I look at this building in the sense of driftwood. The driftwood, in a way, carries stories. And this is the production house for theatre, which tells stories. So now I go back to my text, and I hope I'm not going to be too long. And I hope you're not asleep. I can't see anybody out there very much. So the question now is, how are we behaving as designers? I'll give you a minute just to read the left and right columns. It's more than 100 years ago that the link between CO2 from coal was established. Human beings are very, 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 very slow animals. They think they're clever, but we're not really, not very. And usually we can never tell when a disaster's hitting us, or a catastrophe, until it's happened. Hopefully in 2009 in Copenhagen, there will be a real, genuine move. There's a lot of talk about the United States not joining in Kyoto Agreement. The Kyoto Agreement, if we want, in a very sensible way, was absolute rubbish, because it didn't represent any real target at all. It was a nominal 5% reduction. Now, there's a guy who heads up, he's the director of the NASA Goddard Space Studies Center in Columbia University, James Hansen, who's essentially a climatologist. Yes, he's worked on the Venus programs for NASA, landing balloons and all the rest of it in space, but he's a person that deals with the atmosphere. Now, he wrote about 3 weeks ago to Michelle and Barack Obama, pointing out the CO2 levels that are being talked about by politicians. Now, currently, if you take the Stern report, which was the Intergovernmental Committee for Climate Change, they came out and said 450 to 500 parts per million, okay, good target. We're currently at about 380, 385. The last time 450 parts per million was known to exist, and this is from the ice cores taken from various parts of the planet, many thousands of years ago, sea levels were 20 meters higher than they are today. Just think about it. So, is there such a thing as sustainable growth? Or is it better to understand that we seek sustainable progress, humane settlement on a grand scale, and development towards a better world for all? How are we behaving under these conditions today and within this condition? Sustainability, of course, is a general term, interpreted and appropriated by all types of government, companies, institutions, and agencies, as to render it almost meaningless. I would take a bet that even the Lehman Brothers had used it in their marketing campaigns. Surely today, we have to ensure that we have a shared understanding of what sustainability means, of the skills to work towards this aim, and of the values that relate to their wider social, environmental, and economic responsibilities, and which will encourage others to learn and participate. Durability or survival seems to be its root meaning. The World Commission on Environment and Development's definition of sustainability is as follows, and I'm sure it's familiar to you. meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Well, clearly, sustainability is so important, yet an unbelievably complex matter to comprehend. Even this definition refers only to human beings, forgetting to mention other life forms. It also, in a funny sort of way, implies that what we are doing now, needs of the present, is justified. I'm bothered that this seems essentially to maintain the status quo. An example of hyperbole, I think. Most designers believe they are essentially doing good, but in simple terms, obtaining more performance out of less material, polluting less, wasting less, and recycling more is about as far as it goes. Obviously, reorientating and changing our consumer society without suddenly destabilizing it, while changing from harmful to benign, is an enormous challenge. But our thinking must move on. There is a need to accelerate major R&D and investments in benign biospheric materials, products, industries, buildings and infrastructures, and management techniques, on a level that will eventually replace the old industrial processes and methods. At one level, this entails understanding how every fiber of every material behaves in the life of making and using artifacts, and being able to separate them easily with low energy input at the end of their first useful life, such that these fibers can be recycled positively into the next useful product. I'm sure this sounds familiar to many of you. This is the idea, if you like, of the circular economy, and the term cradle to cradle, coined by Walter R. Stahl, a Swiss architect, in 1972. And it was based on the research for the European Union to look into, and this is interesting, the ecological, environmental, and social advantages of a service-based economy rather than one based upon products. At the moment, the contradictions are inescapable between producing architecture within the current economic model and helping to create a more intelligent world in which moral and social justice prevail rather than economic imperatives. And this is the principal conundrum that has concerned me since I began my own practice in 1976. Our approach to sustainability is fundamentally about limiting the consumption of resources by anticipating the future. We do not build if it is not necessary. We are on project number 618, I think, at the office. We've probably built 40 buildings. The number of times I have stopped a project because it makes no sense to do it. Bit embarrassing as an architect, maybe. But when we do think it's okay to build a building, we aim to optimize the life of that building. And in a way, for the past 20 years, design and environmental concerns have become synonymous. The objective being to design and make things that contribute positively rather than negatively towards the environment. So, satisfying man's insatiable appetite for energy to power his constructed civilizations without ruining our biosphere irrevocably is the challenge for the energy industry. But the energy industry should not be allowed to act alone. The foreseeable future will be all electric, whatever the source of its production. Why? Because it responds directly to every power demand we need. So electricity matters. Yet after nearly 200 years, we still have not yet developed ways to store it, either in quantity or efficiently. And that's another challenge for our industrialists and our engineers and our scientists. Electricity is invisible, except when you see it going across the country in high voltage distribution networks. And we still need to generate, distribute, and store electricity better, more benignly and safely. And both Europe and the US are looking very hard at DC. And this is partly related to the fact that we produce most of the renewable energies to DC. Converting it to AC is bonkers, because you start losing energy, wasting heat, and then you convert it all back again when you meet your fridge inside your kitchen. And AC is a very expensive and not very efficient way of delivering electricity over very long distances. But the consequences of having to construct a parallel grid or a new grid is massive. Massive for all developed countries and developing ones. So renewable and non-renewable electrical energy will be generated somewhere. And the first question is whether it is internationally, nationally, or locally produced. The only feasible local production of electricity, if you want to stick it on a building, is photovoltaic. Exceptionally, a windmill, wind power. But photovoltaics remain a very, very long way from feasible for the vast majority of people clustered in cities. And despite government subsidies both here and in Europe, and Germany leads, or was leading that until the Chinese took over, government-imposed premium rates the power companies pay to take the excess that you produce off your house into the grid. It's a very distorted market. And I suspect we'll find that people will be pulling out, governments and investors will be pulling out of PV. I don't know if there are any PV people in the house, but I don't think it's the future at the moment. Not until we get cheap wallpaper versions of it. But leaving that aside, logically, we should aim for zero energy exchange between the inside and the outside of the building. Insulating the building is very, very easy and very economical. Window assemblies that incorporate warm edge technology can go as far as thermotropic resins or nanogels. Proper shading can reduce summer heat gain and increase winter thermal insulation. A global insulation effort on all the stock of buildings that we're likely to keep for the next 30, 40 years would cost far, far less than building new power plants. And it's only in very hot climates is refrigeration needed. Ventilation for people is a major issue, not only in terms of air quality, but also smell, odor. And ventilation, fresh air, is by far the major part of the heat load for buildings. But how much do we really know about smell? Richard Axel at Columbia, a Nobel Prize winner, a few years back, identified the link with some colleagues between the olfactory system and Parkinson's disease. We don't really know what the limits of good smell or bad smell are to us. Not really. It's a very, very fuzzy area. And yet we push in air at phenomenal rates just to keep ourselves a little bit happier. Maybe we have to think about it. Light, too, is vital but problematic. Natural light is carbon-free. Glazed areas should be the minimum to meet light targets and to minimize heat loss in cold weather. For a home, say 50 lux. That's daylight or artificial light. Is more than adequate for most activities, unless you're focused, painting, knitting, writing. An office, typically in Europe it's 300 lux, other parts of the world 500 lux. And that represents over half the carbon footprint of a typical office building. And it's totally and utterly unnecessary. You could design an office with 75 lux quite adequately as the background lighting, and using 15-watt task lights, you'd have more than adequate 300 lux, 400 lux where you work. That simple move will reduce dramatically the carbon footprint of nearly every office building in the Western Hemisphere. I'm interested in an architecture that expresses the need to deprocess and decontaminate the manufacture, distribution, consumption of building materials and energy in the interest of conserving natural resources. And I know you can do really nice buildings. They can be really fun and good looking. They don't have to be hairy and grassy. And what it comes to is finding an architecture where you can express perhaps metaphorical intelligence. So there's a relationship that the public can understand to the approach of the architecture. For me, back in 1969, as a young student, a book was published in America called Design with Nature by Ian McHarg, a Scotsman like myself. And in many ways, it represents our approach to design. What McHarg set out was much more at a bigger scale in terms of territories and cities and highways, was the idea of mapping. And he was, in a way, the first person to look at the ecology of the surfaces on which we work. But more fundamental than that, he highlighted the fundamental ecology, which is geology, the one that supports everything else. And it was that mapping, which was done by hand-drawn maps, that determined so much. And in a way, that approach to design has more in common with traditional aesthetics in the East, where I was lucky enough to live in Japan for a year when I was in 1970. And there, you don't seek to impose form upon the landscape, but to allow it to emerge from it. Not to control it, but to be part of it. And not to assert one's own identity, but to be absorbed by that environment. In architecture, the spread of modernism, brutalism, and high-tech aesthetics reflected the globalization of architectural style that occurred during the 20th century and the archi-egoism of the 21st century. Similarly, personal products, the car, bicycle, DVD player, clothing, mean that finding differences is becoming more difficult. Cultural difference is becoming invisible to the eye, but perhaps not in the mind. And it is here that the soul or spirit of place, an object, resides. Now this brings us on to the more obvious. How then are we designing in today's conditions? Initial reflections on sustainability and design in the late 1970s as a pragmatic search for a clean eco-design, which was triggered by the oil crisis of 1974, it must be said. Methodology became, for some of us, a more fundamental inquiry into the problem of design in general. And this implied a re-evaluation of design in terms of an impending evolution from an industrial reductionist culture to that of a post-industrial holistic one. In other words, towards an ecological or biospheric culture. And of course, this opened up our ethical investigation to include a more social, political, and philosophical criticism of ecological design. A complex, but I think indispensable step if we were to take the redesign of design seriously. An object or structure has intrinsic characteristics that we can recognize and which are independent of their surroundings. This sounds like Descartes at his best. It assumes that an object, separated from the mode of thought of its designer and its mode of production, presents to us, as a subjective viewer, identifiable, although not necessarily universal, qualities, such as beauty, harmony, truth, and so on. Western philosophy, in its rationalization of each historical paradigm, has upheld a certain collection of criteria as being absolute or fundamental. And we know that these have shifted with historical paradigms. The succession of them has produced a long history of different and often contradictory results, each entirely dependent on the specificity of the particular time, culture, space of its inventor. There has never been established irrefutable criteria for judging quality, such as truth, goodness, beauty, progress, diversity. And this can cause a problem for us in interpreting our surroundings. And it goes back almost to a shared understanding of what sustainability might mean. In a more overt way, for example, the Eiffel Tower in Paris. It was unbelievably hated by Parisians, by writers, philosophers, during its construction. Poor old Gustave Eiffel went bust twice trying to do it with his own money. But the moment there was a terrorist threat in it, in the 70s, the first thing you protect in France is the Eiffel Tower. So somewhere along the line, the aesthetic dimension, the aesthetic appreciation, the quality of beauty, perhaps, changed. For the Eiffel Tower is now loved. And this problem extends to our perception of reality, as well as the way in which we act upon that reality, as in construct, design, destroy. If we are to determine and employ any criteria by which to judge impact, and thus quality, we must take into account and in some way resolve these paradoxes. Consider our present society, where truth in design is considered, if at all, a secondary quality. We have become inured to the image that accompanies a consumer product, which is a representation systematically constructed as a separate entity to conform to the prefabricated desire of the consumer market. This representation takes on a primary role as a substitute for the profound meaning of the object itself. This distinction between image and meaning contributes to obscuring from our eyes and our minds the nature and importance of an object's indirect impact. For an object to have meaning, it must be perceived and experienced. Architecture simply cannot be experienced through magazines and architects' web pages. Thinking differently inevitably leads to innovation, which begs the relevant, timely question today: what is the relationship between architecture and post-industrial innovation? Creativity and innovation in architecture works through the investigation of memory, context, and the way buildings can be constructed. These investigations take place with both a sense of freedom and discipline. For example, the notion of transparency, of promoting the public examination of government, was first put forward in the modern age by the then French President François Mitterrand in 1981. At the La Villette Cité des Sciences, we translated this into an architecture through a technically innovative facade. Large transparent glass structures subsequently became sort of de rigueur, I don't know the Americanism, became a convention, a habit from then on, and remain prominently across the planet as a metaphor for transparency. Our design actually related to a political objective about the openness of government and the connection of every single secondary school and university to the City of Science. It was about access. However, glass is transparent only when one views it more or less perpendicular to its plane. The horizontal and vertical, oblique or tangential view is that of a mirror. Glass is solid, transparent, a mirror, structural and vulnerable. It offers a myriad of qualities, and the way we use it sends a message. I can remember John Cage commenting on the broken reflections of glass buildings emerging downtown in LA in the 60s and 70s, that they reflected our society, fractured. We have to ask ourselves whether we can influence the evolution of design in general, and if so, how to go about it. Improvements in materials have largely been based upon one single objective: to be able to better predict their performance, thereby improving performance and reducing costs. This is no longer sufficient to meet the demands of the new paradigm. In other design fields, such as, and this is a make-up field, electro-neuro-biomedical engineering, solutions to enable the blind to see and Alzheimer's sufferers to recall are now being found. We have to ask ourselves, in our field, what are we doing? Because these developments result from the new synthetic disciplines, not the old classes of engineering. And despite pretensions to the architect's importance, and certainly the media has played its part in this myth-making, architects rarely initiate new directions. Our power is essentially formal, because that is the skill we apply most significantly, until now. A basic redesign of products, in conjunction with new standards for recycling, toxic elimination, energy and resource efficiency, dematerialization, is complex. But I don't see that many architects interested in this aspect of design. They tend to prefer the traditional areas of urban space development, housing type and density, and it's there that they have their influence. Architects are rarely in the forefront to prescribe or determine in any consequential sense the context, use, production, cost relationship, profitability, marketing, durability, ecology of the materials from which we make architecture, and thus the possible architectures that could exist. We don't work closely enough to influence industry. And the challenge will be how to pull together and evaluate all of the data, if all the data is indeed available. It is obvious that new intellectual and creative alliances are needed in our discipline. The impact of legislation and technological change on energy consumption still remain very slight. The ways in which we use or waste energy seem part of a world power game. Europe, along with the USA, continues to exert a disproportionate influence in the exploitation of the Earth's resources, while using China as our global consumer factory. And energy is one of the most dramatic examples of this. The ethos of the so-called right of the individual to enjoy freedom, of private transport, the products of energy-intensive industry, and an inefficient but comfortable home and work environment demands a very high price. And the short-term view of material gain and the difficulty we have in altering these values could change when legislation, rather than hope for universal enlightenment, brings about a different set of criteria and performance. I think if we believe more in the power of collaboration, cooperation, and the fundamental altruism of humans as part of our instinct for survival, then this paradigm shift will become more evident. We do not need to undermine, but to redefine the principle of an economic structure in the world with ethical values. For we have the ability to create competitive new industries and products that pose no health risk, that positively serve us and our entire biosphere. 5, intervening. How should we personally make things? The 5th issue, making things means doing things. And by implication means intervention, intervening with some responsibility. My architecture starts in the spaces I create in my mind. And it's vital that I'm able to explore the spatial landscapes of a project within my mind and then connect them to the physical landscape. The natural and man-made landscape is physical space. I have sought and researched for ways of designing architecture that is landscape and not simply integrated or conceived as an object in landscape. To be able to read our reality requires a reference, and that reference is our dreams. If you're going to be an architect and you can't dream, stop now. It's not worth it. And the beauty of dreams is that sometimes they question reality's reality. So the architecture we produce and how we make our buildings reflect our worldview. And although there needs to be a revolution, realistically, there can be no revolution in the industrialized regions of the world with regard to the way we extract, process, manufacture, distribute, design, and consume materials. Only a long campaign or a catastrophe will eventually change our habits. And we're not helped because it is so difficult to get real access to hard facts on labor, energy, environmental and social impact, and the effectiveness of recycling materials used in construction. I showed several slides of our work with copper. The largest copper mine in the world today is New York City. Architecture is culture. Willem Flusser, the Czech-born philosopher, made a convincing argument in his short essay, The Factory, that it is through the factory, the place of manufacture, that we can understand the science, politics, art, and religion of a society, and identify the human being in that society. His sense of humor suggested that Homo faber, the maker, was perhaps a better description of the common characteristics of man, rather than Homo sapiens sapiens. The materials and physical spaces that our architectural thinking ultimately has to engage with is a powerful witness to Homo faber. But today we have to ask deeper and more difficult questions if we are to find solutions that respond to the idea of a man and a society that cares. While watching a log burn, my friend. He's my favorite friend. He tells me that I'm a body distorted. Not many of us design for all the senses. I can't think of one architect that does, which means we're designing for part robots. Pass on. So while watching a log burn, we can see how change reveals the beauty of the flame and the log as it slowly transforms into ash. The water that forms a wave breaks, foams and reforms as a retreating surface, always comes back, in part, as a new wave. These wonderful phenomena are examples of the non-linear world that nature presents to us. And I'm convinced that beauty is in large measure non-linear. Creating architectural beauty may come from allowing the play of nature's non-linearity. But the time frame of architecture is long, and one needs to feel, with joy, a sense of change occurring in response to the environment. And this is to imagine architecture that has depth, endurance, and beauty derived from nature. The flame is evidently non-linear, whilst copper, for example, is linear. Both can reveal the energy of sunset. The flame has it, the copper reflects it. Copper oxidizes. The reflective quality of materials has always appealed to me. I see reflections of the clouds moving, the sun setting and the raindrop falling, and interfering with these reflections as a genuine source of beauty, of the non-linear. We have all seen, I think, proposals, largely surface, elemental and spatial representations of certain states and interpretations of non-linearity. One can think back a few years to chaos and fractals. They are easily read as images to be consumed, rather than profound investigations into capturing some elusive and wonderful phenomena that surrounds us. The beauty of non-linearity requires a view of architecture and architectural space that is intrinsically dynamic. There has to be a contribution from the surface which is beyond reflection and beyond itself as a skin. It has to reveal transformational qualities, sensitivity to light and shadow, to burning sun, wind and rain, to change, albeit slowly, not to stay the same forever. An aesthetic intent is useless. And by that I mean useless. It's unquantifiable work, and most students of architecture spend at least half their time doing it. This useless, unquantifiable stuff. But it has more impact upon how we feel as through the results of economy or efficiency. Every client wants economy and efficiency, quite rightly. And combined together in spatial form, they provide a fitness for purpose. But the aesthetics involves the designer in investigation, research and rejection of ideas of space, feeling and appearance. They take time and do not appear directly to profit the client, and often the client sees no real point in paying for them. However, designers must invest in them. If these intangible issues, for they remain such until the work is realized, are driven by the moral dimension of aesthetics, that embrace the idea that we design not just to satisfy the immediate needs of our client or your tutor, but for future generations, then the aesthetic issues become far more significant. And I just mentioned that the aesthetic dimension must include all our senses. Hello. Yeah, okay. So taking account of the hidden dimensions, those senses, you can all think of the big 5 senses, but we reckon there's maybe up to 15 to 20. The one when your stomach feels tense is a sense which is not one of the 5. These hidden dimensions, we're going to have to work out hard as designers as we densify our cities. So, in wrapping up, I'll jump to the end, which is a pity, but anyway, such is life. Yeah. Right to the end. So these are the bits you missed. That's because I'm too slow and it's 4:30 for me and I'm a bit tired. There's a very nice story with this one. I'll leave it on that. So I've seen tonight that the projects in my own work range from molecules to monuments. And as many parameters as our methodologies and minds can handle are juggled at the same time. They are framed by the laws of physics and limited only by our knowledge, imagination, and ethical stance. And I hope that the paradigm I'm referring to tonight, you've registered, is far more than some architectural style. It recognizes a world that is already urbanized and is globalizing with little evident shared humanity. For those of us living in economically powerful societies, it is about a fundamental change in the way we think, behave towards each other, design, and make things. So, let's mobilize. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And we're actually going to do a Q&A and 10 minutes.